So this Attuned webinar is titled How to Foster Meaningful Work in Your Organization, and I'm very happy that you've joined. Today, we're going to offer suggestions to help you. We've seen people from HR, I'm assuming a lot of leaders are in the room as well, to appreciate what meaningful work is and isn't, understand why your organization should care about it, and know how to help it flourish, and get as many practical ideas as we can so we don't give too much theory. And to do this, we're privileged to have two guests that are experts in this area. Katie Bailey, thank you for joining us. You're a professor of work and employment at King's Business School at King's College London.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
She's joining us from London. I'm assuming you're in London right now. You've written extensively on this academic articles and also lay articles. You're the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Meaningful Work. So you've literally worked the textbook on meaningful work. And you speak about the importance of meaningful work at conferences around the world. And I'm really glad that you've come here to share with us. You also founded at King's the Meaning and Purpose Network of academics and employers, whose aim is to create more ethical, inclusive, and sustainable futures for organizations through partnership and knowledge sharing. And I hope you'll tell us some more about this during the conversation. Then we have Blake Allan joining us from very hot Houston, Texas. You're associate professor and program director of counseling psychology at the University of Houston. Your primary focus is on the quality of work, encompassing constructs such as underemployment, precarious work, decent work, and meaningful work. You work on conceptualizing and measuring these constructs, how structural factors distribute poor quality work, and how this relates to mental health. So I think it's great that you have quite complementary expertise here. And I'll introduce myself. I'm Tanya Rabesandratana. I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic, so I will here to ask all the simple questions that sometimes might seem silly. And I encourage you to ask questions during the conversation in the chat as well, and we do our best to answer them towards the end. And I won the Attuned Writer Fellowship, which allowed me to spend a year to explore intrinsic motivation in a Substack newsletter. And that's also how I came across Blake Allan's work. I interviewed you for a newsletter article about intrinsic motivation at work. And today's event is part of a series of webinars hosted by Attuned. If you're registered for the event, you're probably familiar with the work of the company. Attuned is a platform driven by AI and backed by psychology that shows companies what really matters to their employees by measuring and visualizing the values and intrinsic motivations that drive each person. And this helps busy managers to get to know their teams quicker, identify blind spots, communicate more effectively to increase engagement, productivity, innovation, have more psychological safety, and ultimately happier organizations. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the key issues together as a conversation. As I said, you're very welcome to add your questions to the chat as we talk. And then we have about 15 minutes at the end for your questions and comments. And we'll get started. I'm going to catch up on the chat. John said, meaningful work to me means that you know how your job impacts others, and that's important to you as the one actually performing it. Phyllis says, I like Joanne's definition of meaningful work. Let me go back to Joanne's definition of meaningful work. Where was it, Janice? Certainly having work with purpose and a positive impact on the lives of others. I think that's what you're referring to. And you add that it provides opportunities to solve challenges and to accomplish personal and organizational goals aligned with values. Yeah, so we're seeing some running themes in your answers, but I think one thing I've learned when I was researching, preparing for this event, is that there is not one single definition of meaningful work within academia in general. And that is an assessment that's made by the person, by the individual person, based on different elements. So it's not just one dimension that we can measure easily. And also that any work can be meaningful. So it's not about whether you're working as a doctor saving lives, that might seem very obvious, but any work can be considered meaningful. And I'd like to mention a quote by a philosopher and psychology researcher, Frank Martela at Aalto University in Finland. I interviewed him for the article with Blake, and he said, you don't have to be Nelson Mandela to experience meaningful work. And that was a very easy thing to remember for me, that is really not about being a hero saving lives or doing something that is considered universally meaningful, but it's a personal definition. And I hope my panelists will agree with me. So Katie, I wanted to ask you in the first place, why several people have joined today and seem to be interested in this issue and seem to care about this, but why should organizations care about meaningful work? What happens if employees don't find their work meaningful?
Well, it's a very good question, Tanya, and a very important question, and I'm glad you've asked that. I think I'll start by quoting someone who I was talking to not that long ago. I was running a workshop in an organisation that taught preschoolers, and so we were talking about, why is your work meaningful? And one of the participants, called Laura, she told me that she'd had a very good job in a bank, which she'd really enjoyed up to a point. It was very well paid, very, very secure. But ultimately, over time, she felt increasingly disconnected from the values of the organisation. She felt that she was moving one way, the organisation was moving the other, and she'd always loved children. And she decided to take the plunge, stop working in a bank and go and work in an organisation where she could look after preschoolers. So in doing that, she, to a certain extent, gave up quite a lot of pay and reward and security and benefits and so on. But you could just see how much she loved her work and how much it meant to her. Her face lit up when she was talking about the children and the work she did with them. And I think that really very much illustrates what meaningful work is all about and why it matters so much. The research in the States has shown consistently over about 30 years that the one thing that people really value most about their work is meaningfulness, over and above income, job security, and so on. So meaningful work is something that really matters to people. So because it matters to us as people, it has to matter to employers as well. We don't find our work meaningful, the outcomes are pretty much like Laura. People are much more likely to quit. They're also likely to suffer negative health outcomes, such as depression, anxiety, stress. On the other hand, if you find your work meaningful, you're much more likely to enjoy your job, to be committed to your organisation, to have higher levels of well-being, higher levels of performance as well, and higher levels of engagement. So there are lots of really good and important reasons why employers should be concerned about meaningfulness. And I read a statistic recently from McKinsey that said only around 50% of people find their work meaningful. So there's quite a lot of people out there who are in jobs who do not find them meaningful. And so they're kind of missing out on this positive cycle of benefits that arises if we find that meaning in our work.
This brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you a bit later, but maybe if it's okay, I'll ask you now. Can anyone develop a sense of meaningful work? If we have 50% of people who don't find their work meaningful, does that mean we can raise that figure to 100%? I don't know if Blake has, or UK, do you have anything to say?
Well, I think pretty much from my research anyway, people in all sorts of different jobs find their work meaningful. And in one study, we interviewed people in about 12, 13 different occupations, ranging from priests through to nurses, solicitors. We talked to people working in shops. We talked to stonemasons. We talked to all sorts of different people, and refuse collectors. Everybody in all of those occupations could talk about where they found meaning in their work. There are, of course, some people for whom meaningfulness, they don't necessarily derive it primarily from their work activities. They maybe get it from other areas of their life. So it is important to have a kind of holistic perspective of us as whole human beings. We bring our whole selves to this question of meaningfulness. And that sometimes in our lives, we might find more meaning in work and less in other aspects of our lives. And it's going to ebb and flow over the life course for all of us. But one thing that we do all want to do is to find that sense of meaning somewhere.
Blake, you do in-depth research about decent work and meaningful work, and I'm interested in understanding the link between the two things. One of the questions I'm wondering about is this: having meaning at work, is this accessible? Having meaningfulness at work, excuse me, is this accessible to everyone? Is decent work is always a very important piece of that.
Yeah, well, so I think the first point is Katie did some really cool research looking at how, our sense of meaningful work is not like this static thing that doesn't change. It ebbs and flows in our job. And sometimes we find it really meaningful. Sometimes we have moments of meaningless and feel like, why am I doing this? This is a waste of time. And so I think anyone can have that sense of meaningfulness in different things. I remember when I was a graduate student teaching undergrads, you get you're like 100 students in your class, you're like grading, and it's just such a grind for like 2 or 3 days. But I remember I always learned the name of my students. Like every 100, I would go through the whole class and memorize it. I don't think I can do that anymore. But this one student took every class I taught in graduate school. I never had a conversation with her. But she came up to me when she was graduating and handed me a handwritten letter and said, thank you so much. And I'm like standing in line at the sandwich shop reading this letter saying, like, you knew my name and you just said hi, and I learned so much from you. And I'm like bawling in this line in the sandwich shop. Everyone's looking at me like, what is going on with that guy? So that was like a really powerful moment of meaningfulness. And it's like, wow, this really matters, even though I didn't know. And I've probably done that with other students that had just never wrote me a letter. So we have those really powerful moments, but I think being able to experience meaningfulness and to build this overall sense of, like, if I ask the audience, is your work meaningful? Yes or no, right? I mean, you sort of pull it all together and make that decision. I mean, the sort of short version is that through our research, we've shown that it's a lot easier to have meaningful work when you have freedom of choice of your career. But a lot of people don't. I mean, a lot of the world are going in survival jobs and just trying to make it and taking what's available in their small town. There's some choice, but it's not like I have a lot of intergenerational wealth and things like that, and I get to decide whatever my job is, and I'm going to choose something that lives out my values and is really meaningful. So I could say more on that, but that's the sort of crux of it, is that sort of autonomy to choose whatever job you want is really powerful in choosing a job that aligns with your values, similar to the story that Katie told.
I love that story about you in the sandwich shop. Yeah, and we had John in the chat who also shared a similar story of his ex-wife who also changed to work in a school. And I think we've all heard these stories of reinvention, of completely changing career, and finding a lot more meaning in a new career. But I was wondering, how can organizations foster the employee sense of meaningfulness so that they don't have to go seek it in something radically different that maybe and maybe your organization's work doesn't sound extremely exciting and you're not in contact with the reward of grateful children or students on a regular basis. So there are so many levels and so many things I'm sure that organizations and people can do. So Katie, maybe you can give us some examples of good practices you've seen, maybe through the network that you've founded, to give us some inspiration.
Yes, sure. And I guess I liked your story, John, about your ex-wife as well. And I think, as you were saying, Tanya, sometimes we have to change completely to go and find something that's more meaningful. But other times there's ways that our current jobs can change or be made different so that we can tap into a greater sense of meaningfulness. So I think before I answer your question, Tanya, just a couple of things I wanted to say about meaningfulness that makes it quite special and therefore quite difficult as something to actively manage in organizations. Because we think, for example, about employee engagement. If we want people to be more engaged, here's a list of 10 things we can do that are going to, if you do all of these, people are going to be more engaged with their work. Meaningfulness isn't necessarily quite like that, because as we were saying earlier, it's very subjective. And I think you mentioned this in your introduction, Tanya. We tend to see meaningfulness as a subjective sense of what really matters to us about our work. And I certainly know in the interviews I've done over many years with people about meaningfulness, it's one of the few things where you talk to people and they'll immediately talk to you about their family, their friends, their hobbies, what's going on outside work, just as much as they'll talk to you about what's happening in work. So what makes meaningfulness so different perhaps from other types of constructs is it's very, very personal and bound up with who we are as a person. So as soon as you start then intervening to try and influence that, people can get very suspicious very quickly and feel that they're being manipulated. So it's very important, I think, from the research that I've done is it's much more about creating an ecosystem or an environment where people can find that sense of meaning for themselves, rather than be told, this is why you should find your work meaningful. Because I think a lot of people would just say, well, actually, I don't find that meaningful, and I'm not necessarily going to articulate that and share that with you, but inside I don't find that very meaningful. So it's about having an awareness that it's subjective, it's very personal. It's not something where you can tell people what to do. But one of the things we found was that there are 4 main areas where organizations might want to think about how they can help people find meaningfulness. The first one is at the organizational level. So what is your organization all about? What's its purpose? What's it there to do? And certainly the organizations in my meaning and purpose network at King's College are very much spending a lot of time trying to articulate a clear sense of purpose that is authentic and meaningful for their organization and the people who work in it. So if you feel you work in an organization where you feel you fit in, you're more likely to find your work meaningful. The second thing is about the job that you do. And there's been a lot of research, and I know Blake's done research on this as well, about job design and how the jobs that we do create opportunities for us to find a sense of meaningfulness. And one of the key things with that is a sense that, and somebody put this in the chat, that it's about having a sense of what I do in my job makes things better for somebody else somehow. And I think Blake's example really illustrated that very well earlier on. So having that sense of connection with the beneficiaries of your work in some way. The third dimension is the individual tasks that make up your job. So when we were doing our interviews, some of the academics we spoke to talked about dropping spreadsheets into a black hole, constantly being asked to produce a spreadsheet about something, and then the same request again from somebody else in another part of the university, could you provide this information? And they couldn't understand why they were being asked to do this. So there's a sense that some of the tasks we ask people to do may not actually have much point. So thinking about the job design from the point of view of the individual tasks that we do. Some tasks may be pointless, others may actually be quite beneficial, but we're not necessarily aware of why. So articulating why we're being asked to do the things we are asked to do and enabling people to see those connections is important. And then the final thing really is around interpersonal and interactional meaningfulness. So if we work somewhere where we feel psychologically unsafe, we're much more likely to find our work meaningless. It's all part of this sense of community. We feel we're part of a positive community where we're working together and we have a sense of belonging, we're more likely to find that sense of meaning. And similarly, if we're being treated well by our manager and we feel that we're respected and supported, we're also going to feel more of a sense of belonging. So those are 4 key areas for me that come across as particularly important, Tanya.
I'd like to recap those because I thought they were very helpful. So 1, the organization's purpose, and does the person fit in with this with these values? 2, the job design, knowing who you're doing the work for. 3, why are you doing the work? So having a concrete idea of why you're doing the task you're doing. And 4, interpersonal meaningfulness. So that's the community at work. Are you treated well at work? Do you feel psychologically safe? Is that a good summary? Okay. And I was wondering about...
That's an excellent summary, Tanya. Thank you.
Much
more succinct.
And I also, it echoes some of the things that people are saying in the chat. Filling is saying people need to be clear about why they are doing or being asked to do what they do. And organizations can be better by explaining the value to others, client, customers, co-workers, etc. I was also, when you talked about the organization's purpose as the first thing, I was thinking about my LinkedIn feed that seems full of very purpose-driven organizations. It seems very fashionable to have a purpose-driven company. And I've heard that phrase purpose washing, like, there is greenwashing for environmental friendliness, and there is purpose washing for some companies who are just using a lot of fancy buzzwords, but there isn't necessarily a lot of depth or sincerity to it. So I was wondering about that pitfall when you're an organization. How do you avoid that?
Well, I don't know, Blake, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of actually more up your alley, Katie. So you can go first, and I have thoughts that I can add.
Okay. Well, purpose washing is a huge issue, actually. Funnily enough, I've just spent the morning, I've got some colleagues at King's have just written a paper on purpose washing for our MapNet members. And I've just spent this morning working on this paper with them, actually, which is absolutely fascinating. So it's very, very topical, and is something that is a very real concern and consideration for organizations. It's all too easy to come up with a purpose statement, you know, we're going to make the world a better place. But people are intelligent. They look at what you're doing as an organization, and if there's a misfit between what you say you're going to do and what people actually see you doing, then that distrust creeps in, and then accusations of purpose washing, and then the mountain that you have to climb to get the trust back again is really very difficult. So certain companies were given as examples of this in the paper, and I'm sure we can all think of examples ourselves of companies that haven't quite lived up to their espoused purpose. And this is something that's actually very difficult to do. And I do feel a lot of compassion for companies in trying to achieve this, because we're asking an awful lot of companies set up within the capitalist system that we work within, driven by a shareholder logic, to suddenly switch and become driven by a stakeholder logic, and to try and do that in an authentic way when the system is kind of pulling you all the time back towards this, you know, shareholder value creation. So it's not an easy thing to do, but obviously something that's of increasing importance to consumers. That research shows the majority of consumers now want to buy products and services from organizations that have an authentic purpose and that know what it is that they're trying to do to make the world a genuinely better place, given all the polycrises that we're hearing about now that we're facing as organizations. So where people work for an organization where they perceive an authentic purpose, they're more likely to find their work meaningful, but they're also more likely to be on the lookout for discrepancies between what the organization says it's doing and what it is actually doing. So constantly trying to live up to that reputation is something that's quite a challenge, I think.
And I'll just add to that. Sorry, Tanya, I missed the decent work piece. So, I mean, if the audience doesn't really know about the Decent Work Initiative, is done by the International Labor Organization, which sets essentially the minimum standards for work from a human rights perspective. What are the most basic things that people should have in a job? So this is things like psychological and physical safety, having a living wage, being able to have a job that aligns with your personal values, being treated with dignity and respect. And so it's sort of like a different way of thinking about what Katie was saying about sort of setting the foundation of a job. And if you're bare or not earning enough to survive, your work is highly unpredictable, you have a bad, abusive supervisor, you are poisoning someone's ability to have a sense of meaningfulness in their work. So you can say the purpose statement, which I think is a great idea, you know, if that's done authentically. But if you're not establishing that sort of basic level, you know, of respect and dignity for employees, it's going to be really difficult for them to have a sense of meaning that they can flourish. And like those two aspects of decent work, and in sort of my most recent research, that the values alignment is really important for meaningfulness, like we've been talking about. I mean, if you really care about climate change, and you're working for Greenpeace, it's going to be pretty easy for you to establish that sense of meaningfulness. Not guaranteed, but it's easier. If you're working for an oil company, that might be a little bit more difficult for you personally in your value system. So having those values align is really important. That's an aspect of decent work. That's complex, but that's the basic piece. And then the second one is being treated with dignity and respect, because that really sets the foundation that allows people to have autonomy, job craft, so change their job in ways that can make them more meaningful and things like that. So that's like another aspect of that sort of foundation. And I'll say one more thing. We did this study that my colleague ran where we looked at the desire for meaningful work versus actually experiencing it. And we looked at how it related to social class. So people across all different social classes equally desired meaningful work. So everyone wants meaningful work. Of course, that makes sense. We have this will to meaning. We want to make sense of things. We want our activities to be meaningful and valuable and important. But the actually experiencing meaningful work was not equal. That, of course, people with higher social class with more resources and power were able to experience more meaningful work. This was essentially moderated by these meeting of basic needs. So meeting survival needs. So like, are you paid enough to pay rent and get food? And basic psychological needs like self-determination, autonomy, relatedness, having relationships with people at work, having that sense of competence, like I'm good at my job and I can accomplish stuff. So for people who desired meaningful work and had their needs met, that's when they were able to experience meaningful work. So this is a really high complex issue, but I think having that foundational level of respect for employees is really critical.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. It's just like putting things in order before you're trying to just set a shiny purpose statement and on your company website. You just treat people well and provide good conditions for them to work, and that seems like doing things in the right order. Okay, we've talked a lot about values since the beginning of this conversation, and again, that's another word that we use here so often, and in this particular context of meaningful work, I understand the individual values are very important, that they match the company's values or the team's values. We have, different, our values will change across time depending on whatever we're experiencing in our personal life as well. So I was wondering if one of you could speak about that. How do we, is this on us as employees to kind of make an inventory of our values and say, okay, this is what I believe in, this is what's important to me, so I need to look for this kind of work? Or is this something that can happen in any kind of work context, that you can craft your job experience to have to experience that matching values?
Shall I go first, Blake, and then yeah, okay. I think it's both of those things, really, Tanya. It is partly a sort of on us as individuals to think about what matters to us and to try and craft that alignment. But not everybody, as Blake has quite rightly said, is actually in a position necessarily to be able to do that. That can be something of a luxury, to be in a position to seek out jobs which are perfectly aligned with how we'd like to show up in the world. But having said that, where people don't perceive that alignment to be in place, then there are things that people can do to craft their work and change the way they work with other people and what's going on around them, and the nature of the tasks they do, to try and create that sense of meaningfulness. So when I was talking to people working in the retail sector, so in the UK we call them shop assistants. I'm not sure if that's the right term in the States, but people working directly on the shop floor with the customers. And I was talking to them about, well, which aspect of your job is it that you find most meaningful? And a lot of them said, well, actually, I don't really find it very meaningful to be putting money in the till and making more profits for my company. What I actually find really meaningful is we have a lot of elderly and disabled people living in the area. They come into the shop every day. That's their sort of social life. That's a big part of their day. And I've got to know them. We have a chat every day, and I get to know them, what things they like, and I can help them. And it's that interaction, a feeling of sort of the supporting people who come into the shop that really gives that sense of meaningfulness. Now, in some ways, that's not necessarily helping the shop very much. Perhaps these people aren't buying a huge amount, but for the individual workers, that's where they got that sense of belonging, sense of community from. And similarly, people in other types of jobs that I've spoken to, so at another extreme maybe, so solicitors, people working in the legal profession, they would tend to find their work meaningful by seeking out companies within the sector whose values more align with their own, and particular types of legal work, because there's more, in many jobs, there are many different ways of doing that particular job that you have. So looking for a company with a particular value set that you feel more aligns with your own. So there are kind of micro things we can do day to day, but also more macro level things we can do, sort of shifting within the job that we have to align more closely.
Thank you. That was helpful. Blake, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that totally. And I think there's sort of a, like I guess the first thing I'll say is the idea that we want our work to be meaningful is kind of like a semi-modern idea that came from the Protestant Reformation and things like that, with Martin Luther saying, oh no, work isn't just penance, it can be this sort of sacred purpose on earth, right? So that sort of, and then that sort of co-occurs with post-industrialization and things like that, where labor becomes increasingly specialized, and we shift away from values of like security and stability, which we had during sort of the 20th century, sort of industrial values, where really a lot of people stayed with the same company their whole lives, and they identify with the company. Like, I work for Ford or Mercedes or whatever. And what has happened is that we are living in an extremely unstable time. I mean, we have global pandemics, we have this exponential growth of technology. Things like ChatGPT are going to completely upend how we work. And, you know, the labor market is changing so rapidly. People are changing careers more than ever, jobs more than ever, majors and everything, that it's really chaotic. So what that does is it shifts a lot of the risk from organizations onto individual people to kind of establish, well, what are my values? What is my meaningfulness? So I can go to different organizations. And even though I'm changing jobs, changing careers, maybe I am sort of carrying that thread through different experiences, job experiences that I have. And that thread is my personal values that I'm enacting and experiencing meaningfulness in different ways. So I think that there's a downside to that, because I mean, we're experiencing so much pressure to sort of, oh, my work has to be meaningful, right? And that's sort of that's what I was trying to say with the historical piece, is we have a lot of that pressure. I have to have meaningful work, and here's what I want to do. But there's the other side of the coin, in the sense that we have more freedom to be able to determine what that is ourselves, versus just abiding by what the organization is putting forth. So I do think there's more pressure on individuals to do it in this current period we're living in. But like Katie was saying, I mean, it's super complex. It's an interaction between individual people and organizations and communities and things like that. So I definitely think there are things that individual people can do to make their jobs more meaningful.
Yeah,
So sorry, your comments caused me to reflect a little bit, like, there on perhaps the dark side of meaningful work, because we tend to assume it's always a really good thing to find lots of meaning in our work. But there is some research which shows that actually meaningfulness is something that can be exploited by unscrupulous employers to put people in jobs where they have few prospects of promotion, working long hours, they don't have secure work, they don't have where they're not well paid, but people are prepared to endure these kind of conditions because they're getting this sense of their work being meaningful. So there are these kind of downsides to meaningful work as well. It's not all a kind of a rosy picture necessarily. So I think, again, that puts perhaps the onus on us as individuals to take care of ourselves and to try and make sure that we're working in kinds of jobs that not only enable us to experience meaningfulness, but also to experience decent work along the lines that your research has shown as well, Blake.
Yeah. Yeah, and sorry, Tanya, I'll say one thing quickly. Yeah, so we did a study on the dark side of meaningful work where we looked at overqualification, which is kind of this big topic in IO and management, because people who are overqualified tend to turn over and not be very happy. But what we found is that people who were overqualified and had meaningful work, they were the people who were miserable in terms of mental health. They were really stressed and depressed and anxious, because they're like, I have meaningful work, and I believe in the mission, but I'm way overqualified my skills, right? That are really important to be here. And so that's creating a ton of stress. So that's sort of one example of how meaningful work can create issues, mental health issues, when it's sort of in conjunction with other things.
Well, I'm glad you touched on the dark side of meaningful work, because that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. And we're talking about personal sacrifice as well, and these kind of blurring lines as well between personal and professional life. One question I wanted to ask you as well is about the link between intrinsic motivation and meaningful work. I'm guessing there is no chicken and egg in this. It's not like people feel a lot of intrinsic motivation and so they will find their work meaningful. But I'm intrigued in that sort of relationship. I wonder if maybe Blake can talk about that.
I mean, what I would say is that, so we've done some recent studies on this idea of fulfilling work. So that might include, having positive experiences in the workplace, being engaged, having meaningful work, being satisfied with your job. And intrinsic motivation is also like a really closely linked concept with that, because intrinsic motivation, can be that you're doing your job, you just enjoy doing your job. That's your primary motivation for doing it. Of course, I'm sorry. I think.
Blake?
Oh, yes, I'm back.
Okay.
I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
But basically that these sort of experiences that we have of well-being are like so closely related that we found evidence that they're all sort of part of the same process, that you're likely to experience all of them if you're experiencing one of them. We found some other evidence that maybe they are separate things, but they're so closely linked. So that's the idea of like fulfilling work, is that when we really enjoy our jobs, we're likely to find them meaningful. If we find our jobs meaningful, we're likely to enjoy them and be intrinsically motivated, and etc.
So they're overlapping concepts, I think. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying not to get too technical, but yeah, I would say they're extremely closely related.
Okay.
There are some situations, for example, where you might find your work meaningful and not enjoy it. So I think my classic example as an ER nurse is that it's like, okay, yes, this is clearly meaningful. I'm saving people's lives, but I'm like super stressed. This is a high tension environment and I don't really enjoy my job very much. So there are some rare examples like that, but the majority of the time they occur together.
This might be a good time to bring in a question by Jerry in the chat that I think is quite relevant to what you just said. Jerry works in veterinary science and says there's high compassion fatigue statistics in this branch. The reasons we enter the field are undeniably meaningful. How do you address vocations that are meaningful, yet the outcomes, like euthanasia of an animal, can be emotionally devastating? I don't know if Katie or Blake, you want to. Thank you, Jerry, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think this is something that is very significant in highly meaningful work, which can, in a sense, you can have an excess of meaningfulness, and we found that with doctors and nurses and other medical professions as well, where you're having to deal with these life and death situations, which, as you say, can be overwhelming, and also you're constantly dealing with people who need things from you, and that can be very, very draining. And as you say, you get this kind of compassion fatigue. I think the research shows that people need downtime to decompress from these kind of situations and just to step aside on a regular basis and connect with other people in a similar situation. Even things like periodic sabbaticals from that kind of patient-facing roles to get that sort of sense of self back again can be important. I think research shows that meaningfulness is multifaceted, and so there are some aspects of meaningfulness which are to do with how we relate to other people or animals in this case, to others, but there's also the part that's about ourselves. And when these are sort of in tune, then we're more likely to find our work meaningful. So if we're constantly dealing with other people's needs, but we're ignoring our own needs, then that can actually undermine, we end up with an imbalance of meaningfulness. So that can be equally, if not more, draining in some ways as not having enough meaningfulness.
Thank you. I like that was quite practical. Downtime, sabbaticals, connecting with other who are going through the same. I think these are very practical steps. I hope that's helpful, Jerry. Blake, do you have anything to add on that piece?
I think I would just add that if we look at sort of, in psychology, we sort of studied a lot about what it means to have a good life. What does it mean to be happy, right? And in Western countries, we tend to have this bias that happiness is about experiencing lots of positive emotions, but not having negative emotions, which really isn't true in other cultural contexts. In other cultural contexts, for example, it's more like equanimity and balance. You don't have extremes of highs or lows, things like that. And so counter to that has been things like meaningfulness, that meaningfulness is not necessarily about having positive experiences all the time, but really seeing the value in what you're doing in your job, and it's serving as a coping mechanism, which we found in our studies, to help you make sense of why you have to engage in things like euthanasia. So I've been through that with my dogs and stuff like that. So I understand, you know, that devastating experience and the vicarious trauma that people might be experiencing, and the meaningfulness can serve as a sort of buffer to help understand why that's important and sort of move forward in some way.
Thank you both. We're going to finish the part of the conversation that I wanted to have with you. So I already have a question left in the chat to ask. Feel free to add your questions now in the chat and we'll answer them in a little bit. I wanted to ask you, Katie, I think this will be a good one for you. How do we measure meaningful work? So something very practical. I've seen different scales that exist in the academic world. Maybe you have a recommendation for a useful tool that teams could look for to maybe conduct an in-house staff survey, and how to use those results to make it easy to use.
I suspect that Blake has probably got a better answer to this question than I have, but I'll give it a go. I think there are lots and lots of measures of meaningful work out there, and it is incredibly confusing. Together with my colleagues, we did a review of all of the academic literature on meaningful work a few years ago. And at that time, we found that there are 28 different scales in use to measure meaningfulness. And that's confusing for academics. It's also confusing for practitioners who maybe want to add in some measure of meaningfulness into their staff survey. There's a couple of problems as well. One of them is that quite a lot of these measures just use one single question. And I'm not a psychologist, Blake is a psychologist, but psychologists would say that it's not actually a good idea to just use one question to try and tap into an attitude or an experience, because it isn't going to give you enough richness of information. The other extreme, we had some scales that had over 50 items in them, so 50 questions is far too much to put into a regular staff survey. So finding a happy medium where you've got a sensible scale with enough questions in to give you some reliable, valid data, but at the same time, it's not so many questions, it's unmanageable. It's actually quite difficult to achieve. So there are a couple of scales that have been used in this body of literature that have been perhaps used more than others. One is called the Workers' Meaning Inventory, which was from the work of Michael Steger, and that divides meaningfulness into 3 different facets or dimensions. So the first one is about a positive meaning from work, a feeling that your job matters. Another one is about meaning making through work, so the broader context of meaningful work in your life. And then the final one to that is the greater good motivation, so the sense of meaningfulness that you get through the positive impact you get on others. And that questionnaire has 10 items in it, so 10 questions that you would ask to try and tap into a sense of meaningfulness. And what would be useful about including some questions on meaningfulness in your staff survey, however you choose to measure it, I think is it'll give you a real sense of the foundations on which many of the other positive attitudes and behaviours are built, as we were talking about earlier. People find their work meaningful, they're going to be more likely to stay, more engaged, perform better, and so on. So having that sense of how meaningful people are finding their work will give you a good basis. And then you can start to think about, well, why is that? And what can we do to address some of the problems that we're seeing? Blake, I don't know if you'd like to add something to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I mean, I think that often the measures, in one way that they differ is whether they're measuring like the source of meaningfulness or just the sort of narrow perception of asking someone, do they experience their work as meaningful? So it really depends on the purposes of the scale. If you wanted to implement in your organization, sort of talking about what your goals are and which scale might be appropriate for that. So for example, like in one study long ago, it's probably 10 years ago, we did a study, we just asked people, is your work meaningful? And if so, what makes it meaningful? And the vast majority of responses were something to do with contributing to the company, country, or community. So we called it like the 3 C's to try to be cheeky, but so that's a source. Like these are how I'm contributing to these entities is like that source. Versus just asking someone, do you experience meaningfulness at work? So there are some really short scales that are like 5 items of just asking, is your job significant? Do you feel like your job is important? And that can be sort of a quick and easy assessment to use in an organization, versus these bigger scales, which might dig down more deeply into what sources are you missing in your organization, that kind of thing.
Thank you. We have 3 questions already in the chat for our Q&A part. So I'd like to go straight into those. I'll start with Tara. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. She asks, how do you reconcile the different generational attitudes about making work meaningful? My parents' generation had that work for one company for decades ideal with the expectation of company and employees taking care of each other. My generation's attitude was to get a job that pays the bill and allow us to do what we want outside of work. So job is a means to an end and doesn't have to mean much. And lately, generations seem much more touchy-feely about their job satisfaction. She doesn't mean that in a bad way. And a lot of C-suite and company heads don't care what their workers feel; they care about production. So I think there's 2 pieces here. One is the different across generations, and I think Attuned actually had a webinar recently about different generations' approaches to their work and motivation. And also the contrast between what the bosses want and what their workers might want. I don't know who would like to take that one on. Any preferences? Feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll designate one of you.
Okay, I'll give that. I think that's a very interesting and important question, and I think there are generational differences. There are also differences in terms of people's personalities. Some people have a personality type where they're more likely to find work meaningful than others, and you've also got a difference between different sectors as well. Some industries are much more in tune with people talking about their feelings and attitudes and experiences of work than others are. So I've done work with consultancy companies, for example, where there's a lot of conversation going on about, purpose and meaning and what that, how we can design our work to make sure we're helping to make the world a better place. And other industries where it's just people just don't normally talk about these kind of things. My PhD student is doing some research in the engineering sector and on meaningful work, and people aren't used in that kind of environment in that sector to talking about these things. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of complexity about where people are and aren't used to talking and thinking about these things compared with other sectors which are perhaps more receptive and other individuals. So I think it is part of a kind of a bigger picture in some ways. I think where I would say that there is some consistency is that if you go back to the humanities tradition and perhaps the work of Viktor Frankl, who talks a lot about the fact that we are all innately seekers of meaning in what we do, even if we're not necessarily talking about it or articulating it. Fundamentally, it's something that matters to us, even if we don't ever actually speak about it. So I think, but from my point of view, I think meaningfulness is always important, but the way we talk about it and how we treat it and handle it in the work setting is going to vary depending on your industry and what's appropriate in your culture, in your organizational culture as well. So I don't know if that's completely answered the question, but maybe Blake, you've got some other insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a really interesting question. I think it was sort of what I was talking about before, like that these values change over long periods. If people are experiencing a lot of insecurity, then they're going to value that security and stability more self-actualization and meaningful work stuff. I mean, the other thing is that, it's complex because it's hard to tease apart generation and age. And so like in one study, we found that people who had meaningful work meaningful work was much more important for meaning in life in midlife, because in midlife, we're sort of at our peak working ages, around 35 to 50 or so, where work is such a prominent period of our life. The beginning of life, like your early working years in your 20s, and then towards retirement age, having meaningful work was not as important for meaning in life. So it also depends on where you are in life. And this is sort of based on theory, in early life. For example, like in our 20s, we're often focused on finding a partner and getting the family going. And then we shift to work and being generative. And then we, retire and we try to give back to the next generation in a different way. And so things change over the lifespan as well. So I think it's really difficult when you have these large studies that are based on big samples of populations and when you're dealing with an individual. And I think taking individual employees' values, learning about what motivates them, what's valuable, what would be meaningful to them is really important. Now, trying to pull that together across employees is difficult, but I think it's really what we were talking about earlier, creating that work environment where people have autonomy, they can job craft, there's good relationships, respect. That will give people enough. If they have freedom, they will find that meaningfulness in their job in different ways. So it's like that foundation, I think, is really important.
Okay, thank you. Phyllis, who has to leave, just said, as a general expert at work, I don't know what exactly that means, what function you have at work, Phyllis. But she said that she found the differences pointed out above were true between the different generations. And John has a related question and comment. He said, when he was a production trainer, he was trying to instruct people how important it was that their job was done correctly and efficiently, and try to educate people about how their job step before them affected the next steps, and tries to develop a sense of ownership and pride. But he says with the latest working generation, he doesn't really see that working. Sorry, he says, let me use his word correctly. I feel like this is not seen, and maybe with the latest working generation, not even wanted. How do you change that mindset? I don't know if we,
I don't think you do, but
or if we
yeah.
want to, yeah. But it's interesting that there's questions about the generation and mindsets have come up from different places. Okay, Michael had another question.
I could say really briefly to that yeah, I don't think necessarily we need to change the mindset of like iGen or, different generations versus understanding those generations better. And I mean, Jean Twenge, I think is how you pronounce her last name, has done like a ton. She's a psychologist in the US who's done a ton on this about how generational differences are, they're technology mediated often. And that, so instead of sort of saying, well, my generation, we took pride in our work and that was what motivated us. If it's different now with a different generation, I think, trying to understand how to work that versus sort of, I'm going to take what motivates me and hope that it works with that generation, which just probably won't work very well. Not that it's wrong, but it just probably won't work.
Yeah, I can understand that's frustrating for John, but I think that's a really good point, Blake. Okay.
Yeah.
So Michael has another question. How do you make a career meaningful for an employee who just wanted a job? Can you change the way an employee feels about the job? So I want to make sure I understand this correctly. So that means for someone who's just gives priority to other things maybe in their life, and having a meaningful job is not their top priority. I think I understood that correctly. Maybe Katie has ideas about this.
Yes, I think this question, Michael, links very much into this sort of distinction we have between job, career, and a calling. And so some people have a more of a job orientation towards their work. They want to go in, they want to get their paycheck, they just want to do their job. They're not necessarily that interested in pursuing a career or finding meaning in their work. Other people are very much seeing their work as a calling. It's deeply meaningful to them, and that's why they do it. And then other people are interested in a career and in climbing up the career ladder. So obviously, the more you're orientated towards the calling dimension, the more meaningful work is going to matter to you. But that's not to say that people who regard their work as a career or a job can't find any meaning in the work that they do. They might find it in slightly different ways, and possibly not to the same intensity as somebody who perceives their work as a calling. And I think that's one thing we haven't really talked about is the intensity of meaningfulness. We've talked about it ebbing and flowing, but actually the intensity with which we experience our work as meaningful is something that hasn't really come up. I'm collecting data at the moment for a study looking at ceramic artists, and it's been very interesting to see, they love everything they do about their job because it's all to do with ceramic art, whether it's sweeping the floor or, clearing up or dealing with, customers or whatever it is, because it's all wrapped up in this thing of being a ceramic artist. That's what they love. That's their passion. For other people, it may be that one part of their job is going to be that source of meaningfulness, maybe where they're able to see the impact on beneficiaries, but they're never going to see their whole job as a source of meaning. So I think there's going to be huge variation there. But I think for me, at any rate, Michael, the fact is that everybody can find that meaning in their work, even people with a job orientation.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And I'll say really briefly, like we've done some qualitative work recently where people who sort of were more low-wage workers really talked about providing for their families a lot. That was a central motivating factor for work. It wasn't just about like, oh, it's just a job, I need money. It was sort of, I need to provide for my family and build stability for my children. And a lot of that came out. So it's just a different meaning structure. And I think my main takeaway is you have to meet people where they're at and see, what their values are and what's motivating for them. And I mean, I was a line cook. I mean, all that kind of stuff that it was just a job, but I definitely found aspects that were really meaningful.
On an anecdotal level, I think we've talked about generations, we've talked about the influence of religion, age, and all these different things. And I think it speaks about culture more generally in different countries. Also, maybe work will be at the center of our personal experience and bring us a lot of meaning. And in other places, it will be considered unimportant. I mean, I can say that from experience, having worked in different places. Some places, meaning of work is not supposed to be, meaningfulness at work is not expected. It's just nice to have, but it's not so important. Okay, I'm just going to check over the last. We have a question from Heather that is quite meta, and I find it really interesting. Heather says, you mentioned feelings. Why do feelings play such an important role in the workplace now? So, Blake, as a psychologist, I wonder if you're able to give some pointers to Heather here.
Well, I mean, we spend a third of our life at work, and feelings matter because we're always having them, and they motivate us, and our emotional tapestry is the stuff of life. So, I mean, it's no different from why feelings would matter on a Saturday afternoon, spending with your family or anything. It's just a part of life, and work is a part of life. And we like to separate things, right? Like say, oh, this is work. We're going to close it off in this domain, and we're going to treat it like it's something different than the rest of our life, right? But work is just a part of life that is, a place to live out our values or have different experiences. And of course, to get money to survive is the sort of the foundational thing. But so, yeah, I mean, that's my initial thought.
I mean, I wonder as well whether the recent COVID pandemic hasn't played a bit of a role here, because during COVID, there's much more emphasis on well-being, and we saw much more case that line managers were taking the holistic well-being of their employees much more seriously than perhaps they had done before. And people became, I think, more used to talking about their feelings and their general levels of well-being. And I think that's carrying forward into the new patterns of work that we're seeing post-COVID as well. We're seeing people much more as, holistic human beings now in the workplace than perhaps was the case before. And I think that's been a factor as well.
Okay, we've just slightly run over 3 minutes past. I would love to give you an opportunity, Blake and Katie, to say a few more words. Thank you, everyone who shared some questions. Thank you for your time and insights in this conversation. I will wrap up a bit later, but just wanted to give Blake and Katie an opportunity to add anything that we haven't talked about that you think is really important, or the message that you'd like people to take home today or to take to the office tomorrow.
I can just give people a little activity. So maybe this week or this weekend or something, if you sit down and journal and write out a time that was really meaningful for you, especially a time that you felt like you were really helping someone else or contributing to the greater good, and then writing a little bit of exactly more why your work is meaningful, and see if anything changes for the following week. But otherwise, thank you so much for having me. This was super fun, and to talk about these issues. And I feel like we could probably go for, well, the rest of the day here. It's still morning for me, so that would be a long time, but I feel like I could go all day.
Thank you. I will try the journaling piece, and I'm guessing that's evidence-based and not just, I'm sure, I know there's some research into the value of journaling in different work settings. Katie, give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Tanya. And Blake, I'm definitely going to do the journaling thing myself as well. It's nice to be given a task to do and to pause and think. And I think, well, just to echo really what Blake has said, I mean, I think, please, take some time to think about the meaningfulness of your work and how much it matters to you, and also your family members and the work that they're doing and how meaningful they're finding it, and seeing if what we can each do as individuals to help the people around us find more meaning in their work, I think is an important thing. But I've loved having this conversation and meeting everyone, and thank you so much for your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights with us. All the attendees, you will soon get an email with a link to the recording, so you can watch it, share it, watch it again, or share it with your colleagues. And you will also receive information about the next webinar and get a chance to register early. The next webinar is next month, I think on the 26th of July. And it's about how technology can boost engagement and recognition to bridge the distance between team members. Thank you again to all of you for your questions and attention. It's been lovely spending this hour with you, and thanks for allowing me to go 5 minutes over. See you next time.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Bye.
Take care. Thank you.